like to welcome you to WMC Alumni Hall and to welcome you to SmartTALK. And to be clear, our guest, Eric Schwaab, is the smart portion of this duo, and so right now I'm the talk portion. And it's my pleasure to be the host for this event and to serve as McDaniel's ninth president. And if we haven't met, my name's Roger Casey. It's a spectacularly beautiful spring day we have for Reunion Weekend, and let me say welcome home to you alumni. Thank you for being here. Reunion Weekend has obviously been of great interest to the media. Yesterday morning when I got up, I was turning on the TV in the other room, and all I heard talked about was Westminster this and Westminster that. What are the people going to be wearing when they come to Westminster? So I still haven't met William and Kate, whoever they are, but maybe tonight's reunion dinners we'll get a chance to do that. Well, welcome to McDaniel. We were named by U.S. News as one of America's top 125 liberal arts colleges, by Parade Magazine as one of America's top 25 small colleges, and as the best college on the planet by your ninth president. Welcome to McDaniel, whose alumni have argued before the Supreme Court, served as generals, senators, congressmen, and women, directed national arts festivals, led cutting-edge biomedical research teams, and this week could become the National Teacher of the Year. Watch for news about Michelle Scherer of Frederick-Urbana High School. Welcome to McDaniel, the home of athletic champions on and off the field, where this year, senior Brock Gladfelty was named an academic All-American after having broken the school record for wins in wrestling and finishing third in the nation as a heavyweight. His career choice, elementary school teacher. Welcome to the liberal arts in action. Welcome to McDaniel, a global university with campuses in Westminster, Maryland, near DC, and school districts near you, and in Budapest, Hungary. McDaniel, we proudly proclaim, I am McDaniel. And if you don't like that button in English, we'll give it to you in 24 other languages representing the diverse students and faculty of our internationalized campus. Our seniors are 36% more likely to know a foreign language than those graduating from other American universities. Invajo, McDaniel. Welcome to McDaniel. We've been changing lives since 1867 when the train left the station pulled by a powerful locomotive called Western Maryland. And just as the engine named Western Maryland may have changed your life, as McDaniel, that train has once again left the station with today's first-year class, 40% of whom are first-generation college students. Almost a fourth of them are students of color. We, and that includes many of you, have invested $25 million of financial aid into these young people's education this year alone. And why? Because as McDaniel alumni, they are engineers of tomorrow. Tomorrow's CEOs, doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, researchers, governors, and presidents. McDaniel will lead a changing world. McDaniel, we're not in the middle of nowhere, we're in the middle of everywhere. We're changing lives for a changing world, and we're going to ask you to join us and invest in a student. Give to the annual fund, see the new dining hall, be a part of building our new stadium. When you invest in McDaniel, I will promise you this, we will give you lots of change back. Today, it's my privilege to welcome another alumnus who's now changing lives because his own life was changed by the Hill. Before doing so, let me say a word about our Smart Talk format. We're going to have our guest spend a few minutes here, about 15 or 20 minutes, talking about his life experiences and his work. Then we're going to transfer over here to this more comfortable seating area where we'll have a conversation about his job, about the liberal arts, about McDaniel. We want to get your input because we have some cards that we've passed out, and you can get some cards if you'd like to write down some questions. I'm going to get those, and I'll be working on your questions over here while Eric speaks, and then we'll use them to frame the discussion. So now for our speaker. Anyone who knew Eric Schwaab while he was still an undergrad in the late 70s and early 80s will no doubt remember him as a lacrosse star, who in his senior year was team captain, led the team in assists, and tied for lead scoring honors. But those who really knew Eric also learned that he was a keenly observant biology major, whose passion for fishing and the environment dated back to his boyhood in Catonsville, where he spent hours casting his way up and down the Patapsco River. Eric's career of nearly 3 decades in natural resource management began fresh out of college with a job as a natural resources police officer on the Chesapeake Bay, and ascended to an impressive variety of leadership positions with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. He was no stranger to contentious issues as he sought to balance the needs of nature against the demands of industry, most notably those of local watermen while enacting initiatives to rebuild the state's blue crab and striped bass populations. Along the way, he's gained a reputation as a fair-minded consensus builder who relies on science, not politics, to guide his actions. He earned a master's degree in environmental planning from Towson and completed a leadership program at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. In February of 2010, the Obama administration appointed Eric to the helm of the National Marine Fisheries Service at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, otherwise known as NOAA. There he oversees an annual budget of about $905 million and more than 3,000 employees in 6 regions, 6 science centers, 12 laboratories, 15 states. Just 2 months into the job, BP's Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded, killing 11 workers and causing a massive oil leak that lasted 3 months and dumped 185 million gallons of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. Eric plunged into this crisis as point man for federal efforts to protect marine life, ensure the integrity of seafood coming from the region, assess the full extent of the damage, and recover from BP and other responsible parties funds necessary to return the environment to the conditions that would have existed had the spill not occurred. If ever there were a job for a liberal artist and scientist, this is one. With great pleasure and with much admiration, I welcome one of our own back to the Hill for a conversation about the health of our nation's ecosystems and how his liberal arts education has helped Eric navigate a successful career, especially when the waters get rough. Eric Schwaab.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you all for being here with me on what is a beautiful day, and so I know we're in great competition here this afternoon with probably the best day of the year so far, weather-wise, and so I very much do appreciate the turnout, and I appreciate that wonderful introduction, Roger, that you just cut my 20 minutes down significantly. But that will allow us, I think, to move very quickly to the part of the program which will be most interesting to you as well as most interesting to me. I also want to thank Joyce Muller for her efforts in putting this program together. We've been in regular communication over the last months as leading up to today. It is a great honor to be here, and I do want to also recognize 2 people in particular, and I might recognize a couple of others as we go through a few comments. But my mother, Mary Schwaab, is here. And it is just a great pleasure and honor to have her here. With her, one of my sisters, Mary Lynn Schwaab Hersey, also a Western Maryland College / McDaniel graduate. So my mother has 3 McDaniel College graduates, Dr. Casey. It's a particular honor, by the way, for me to be on this stage. What I don't think that Dr. Casey knew, and I was pleased to be reacquainted with Ira Domser when I arrived here, is that during my stay as an undergraduate at then Western Maryland College, I worked for almost 4 years as a technician in the theater shop in a work-study job. And so while the building is in much better condition than it was when I was here, there are many still familiar haunts that I am pleased to see. And I also want to, by way of acknowledgments, note that I'm disappointed that my wife and none of my 3 daughters could be here, but again, we have lacrosse that continues to run through our family, and the younger 2 play for Catonsville High School, and they had a makeup game that was scheduled today. So my wife Valerie, my 2 daughters Rachel and Maddie are there. My 3rd daughter, who is in her 3rd year at College Park, is at Bristol University in England, finishing up a year exchange program over there. So I do think it's important because, as Roger said, the institution here is so much a part of who we become, to take a moment and relate to you one particular story that I think fully embodies the spirit of McDaniel College. When I actually was transitioning from high school to college, I wasn't intending to come to Western Maryland College as a first semester freshman. I actually had enrolled at a much larger institution far away from home. We got there was some kind of a mix-up with housing. It was a large, faceless institution that seemed not to be particularly concerned about my particular problem, and after a few days with my mother and my father, we left and came back. And I came to Western Maryland, having applied here and been accepted, but not enrolling, and I went to the admissions office and I explained my quandary, and I told them that I was hoping to enroll for the 2nd semester. And there was a woman named Joan Muir who ran the admissions office then. And classes had started the previous week here. And she said to me, next semester, why not now? And I said to her, well, I turned down my aid package here, and I'm not sure how the finances are going to line out. And she said, oh, we'll worry about that later. She said, what do you want to take? And I said, well, some kind of science. And she said, go on over to she looked at her notebook. She found a class that seemed appropriate. She says, there's a physics class going on now. You go on over there. And when you get back, I'll have the rest of your schedule worked out, and the money stuff, we'll worry about that later. Now, I'm not sure, Roger, whether you still have that kind of a perspective with respect to the money stuff, but it was quite a welcoming introduction to the college atmosphere, and nothing that happened in my 4 years here suggested an environment any different than that one that I encountered on that very first day. And I'm very pleased, by the way, to see Mike Brown here today. Dr. Brown was my advisor in the biology department. I'm not sure where he got to in the audience, and a number of other instructors. And I think particularly, I have instructors who I took economics from, I have instructors who I had various science classes from, and that liberal arts education is, in fact, the very thing that I credit fully to this day with having allowed me whatever success that I have been able to have professionally, and I believe that very firmly. So I did, as Roger said, have 2 stints at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. When I first got out of school in 1982, seems like only yesterday, the economy was, by the way, very much like it is now. I knew that I wanted to be in the natural resources field in some fashion. And I also, but I did not know how to get into that field in any kind of particular way, particularly in that economy. And so the first job that came along for me was with the Natural Resources Police in the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And so I took that job. It allowed me to be out in the environment on the bay, beginning to do the fisheries work, which ultimately came back to me in a number of capacities a number of years later. And I just want to check the time so I don't go on too long. But after about 2 years with the Natural Resources Police, I knew that I also wanted to be involved in some management capacity, natural resource management. And so I took a voluntary demotion and moved over into the park system. And it wasn't too long after that that I took over management of Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland. And I'll mention one other thing, and Dr. Brown, you might not remember this, but there was at that time, I ultimately fixed on the idea that I would go into forestry. And there was a 3-2 program here that involved 3 years here on campus and then 2 years at Duke University. For all the reasons that a young man makes decisions back in 1981-82, I decided, namely, by the way, a girlfriend and lacrosse, I decided that I did not want to go into the 3-2, fulfill the 3-2 program and go on to Duke, but that I would stay here and finish out my 4 years. Interestingly enough, 10 years later, I found myself running the Forest Service for the state of Maryland, the first non-forestry trained individual to take that job on in that capacity. And so that tells me 2 things. One, there are certain fates, at least in an intermediate capacity, you can't avoid. And then secondly, that the education that was provided me here very much provided me the ability to think and act in the policy arena that frankly perhaps exceeded the abilities of some of the other people who I was in the workforce with. And so after 4 years running the Forest Service, I also took on responsibilities for management of the Wildlife Service for the state of Maryland. Then, in the late 90s, was asked to take on the responsibility of managing the Fisheries Service. Now, the Fisheries Service is particularly unique because, obviously, fish move about quite a bit. They are interjurisdictional in nature. By virtue of having taken on the fisheries responsibility for the state of Maryland, I also obtained a responsibility to work with associates up and down the East Coast, because whether it be blue crabs with the state of Virginia or striped bass, which are predominantly born in Chesapeake Bay and then migrate and are caught all up and down the Atlantic coast, or any number of other species, there were responsibilities that are associated with management that went way beyond the borders of the state of Maryland. I also think it important to note that partly by interest, partly by aptitude, but also partly by training, I have found myself throughout most of my professional career right at that interface between scientists and policy. And so it has been my great pleasure in a number of different capacities as a professional natural resource manager to have just a tremendous number and diversity of scientists who I have had the great pleasure of working with. And as I moved from the state level at the Department of Natural Resources into the federal government with NOAA, that has been just one of the most fascinating and interesting aspects of my professional opportunity. And I do also believe Dr. Brown, Dr. Alsbach, others who are here that had a great influence on me in my formative years, that the capacity to quickly understand that science, regardless of its place of origin, its particular discipline, and then assimilate that and integrate that into some kind of hopefully effective management policy, has been largely born out of my experience here at McDaniel College. When you move into the fisheries arena, by the way, you also take on responsibilities associated with not just natural resources conservation and management, but intense responsibilities to very important, very socially and economically important recreational and commercial fisheries up and down the coast, all around the country, and frankly around the world. And I do believe firmly that the opportunity that was afforded me here to work with Dr. Olsch, Dr. Seidel, others in economics, some of the other liberal arts aspects of my education have been particularly important in positioning me, again, to have whatever success that I have been able to have professionally. So just a few words about NOAA fisheries. You've got some of the basic data from Roger in introduction. We are divided into 6 regions around the country. We manage primarily the federal fisheries. Those are the fisheries, the fish stocks that exist in waters that are 3 miles outside of the territorial limit that are the domain of the states, to 200 miles, which is the exclusive economic zone. We also are directly responsible for implementation of the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act as it relates to a number of other important aquatic species. So we have responsibilities that include fish stocks that primarily exist in federal waters. We have responsibilities for marine mammals, and we have responsibilities for sea turtles, and then some fish stocks that straddle that, such as many of the salmon species on the West Coast. In that capacity, again, we have regional centers, science centers, and regional offices all around the country, and I have the opportunity to spend a good bit of time actually working with leading managers around the country as well as leading scientists in each of those areas. Dr. Casey mentioned that we had great, that early on in my tenure I had responsibility for taking on the oil spill. So I had taken the job in February of 2010, and about in April 20th to be exact, a date that will be forever, at least for us, imprinted in our minds, took over. The explosion happened with the Deepwater Horizon rig, and we assumed the response mode as it related to the oil spill in the Gulf that frankly consumed a significant amount of our attention for quite a period of time from that point forward, for a period of 6 months or so. Initially, that was all about response. Our very first action, interestingly, was one that was related to concern for potential impacts on marine mammals right around the wellhead. And strangely, we did not have particularly good data relating to the distribution of whales and dolphins, turtles as well, in that vicinity. And so one of the first things that we did was we initiated a survey that involved putting planes in the air with biologists and observers that flew transects across that northern Gulf region for the purposes of getting a better handle on what was happening with marine mammals and sea turtles. That ultimately led to specific sets of activities relating to rescue, rehabilitation, and ultimately release of turtles, and in some cases, particularly dolphins. We also, as was reported widely, took on responsibilities for the protection of seafood safety. So as one of the primary agencies responsible for managing commercial fishermen in the region, we worked very closely with the Food and Drug Administration to first implement precautionary closures to fisheries in and around areas that had been and were being affected as the oil continued to flow. So over a period of time on a daily basis, we would monitor the presence of oil, we would monitor its projected movement through the Gulf region, and then make decisions about how to expand the closure area. Interestingly, that was a closure area that was welcomed by commercial fishermen in the region who understood that any steps that we could take to put in place closures that would protect against tainted seafood entering into the marketplace would be in the best interest of all of the rest of the fishermen throughout the region who still very much continued to catch fish and to the extent that markets would allow, move them into the marketplace. Now that became increasingly challenging as we went along, and it continues to challenge them to this day as lingering concerns about the health of seafood coming out of the Gulf region continue to affect shrimp and crabs and oysters and finfish products that come out of the Gulf region. And interestingly, we've said this in many places, in many ways, Gulf seafood is among the most heavily tested, if not the most heavily tested seafood, and therefore probably the safest seafood that you might have the opportunity to consume from anywhere in the world right now. We then moved into initial response activities relating to protection of habitats from the oil. That led to the great debate, which played out very publicly as it related to the use of the application of dispersants to the oil, particularly in the deep water area adjacent to the wellhead. And while we are more than a year out from that event at this point, we believe very much that some of those decisions, while very controversial, and certainly not without their potential costs, were very instrumental in preventing the movements of much larger amounts of oil into the sensitive marsh ecosystems of the northern Gulf. So to the extent that those marsh systems avoided more damage, and to the extent that they have been able to recover more quickly from lighter damage, we believe that largely to be, or at least significantly attributable to the decision, the very controversial decision to apply those, to allow in the response effort the application of those dispersants on the surface of the waters as well as unusually at the release site at depth. Now, of course, that presented its own set of challenges. There were clouds of dispersed oil at depth that, in a way that frankly had never been experienced before in the course of response to an oil spill. The ultimate fate of those clouds of oil were subject again to great debate in the media and as well as within the science community. We continue to explore in great detail the implications of that dispersed oil, in particular the deep water ecosystems immediately around and adjacent to the wellhead, and continue very aggressively to look at those potential implications for long-term health of the northern Gulf ecosystem. So that's just a quick little overview of what we have gone through in the Gulf region. We have responsibilities all over the country that I hope we'll be able to get into a little more in question and answer. I spent the bulk of this week in New England, where we worked very closely, frankly in some cases much to their dismay, with fishermen and fishing communities across New England on the management of important groundfish species like haddock and pollock and cod and flounders that exist up in that area. The Magnuson Act, which governs the federal fisheries, was reauthorized in 2007 in a way that put important new deadlines in place to end overfishing, to rebuild stocks. We are very much in the midst of that challenge right now and are working very closely with fishing communities both to deal with that transition from a biological perspective in the way that we establish catch limits, but also the implication for that for various aspects of the fisheries going forward. So I mentioned there were a few other people, and again, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about some more detail of that in the question and answer period. But I mentioned there were a few other people in the audience, frankly, who have been some of my oldest and longest friends and fishing buddies. And one of whom is a fellow by the name of Richard Soyson, who, when I was here as an undergraduate, had the good fortune of taking a job working for him in the Carroll County Department of Recreation and Parks at Piney Run Park. I view that to have also been a seminal moment in the development of my career pathway. But my association with Richard, his wife Karen, with Dennis and Jan Smith, who are also here, and some other friends, which has spanned over 20 years of professional relationships and personal friendships, caused me to think about one thing that I wanted to share with you that are the words of somebody else before I step away from the microphone. And I share it with you because it's important to me in my relationship with those particular friends, but also with many other people. And I think these are important words for students in particular to think about. So these are the words of a fellow named Edward Abbey. And some of you might have known Edward Abbey as a poet, writer, policy advocate for particularly the wide open country of the West. He wrote The Monkey Wrench Gang. He wrote some other very important works as it related to advocacy for and protection of wild areas. So this is a bit long, but I'm going to end with it. If you don't mind, I'm going to read to you the words of Edward Abbey, which have been a great influence on me, both professionally and personally. One final paragraph of advice. Do not burn yourself out. Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for pleasure and adventure. It is not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it while you can, while it is still there. So get out there and mess around with your friends. Ramble out yonder and explore the forest, encounter the grizz, climb the mountains, run the rivers, breathe deep and of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate the precious stillness, that lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. Enjoy yourselves. Keep your brain in your head and your head firmly attached to your body, the body active and alive. And I promise you this much. I promise you this one sweet victory over our enemies, over those desk-bound people with their hearts in a safe deposit box and their eyes hypnotized by desk calculators. I promise you this, you will outlive the bastards.
With that invective by Edward Abbey, I think we might want to take everybody out fishing on this beautiful 70-degree afternoon. But thank you so much for a great introduction and a lot of material to explore deeper with you. I want to talk first about sort of big picture and then move to small picture. One of the biggest issues I think we're looking at in terms of the world and college education now is the entire question of sustainability. And certainly you're in a daily basis struggling with issues related to balancing the needs of people eating and people's livelihoods with the continued population of the oceans and rivers into the future. And I'm very curious as to your outlook of pessimistic or optimistic about sustainability in the near and distant future.
So we could spend the rest of the day talking about that. But let me say this from a federal fisheries management perspective. I noted that the Magnuson reauthorization of 2007 affected some very important changes. One of those was requiring the agency and working with fishery management councils around the country to put in place catch limits and accountability measures for federally managed species by the end of 2011 for all federally managed species that will ensure that overfishing does not occur, and where stocks have been depressed will require that rebuilding occurs within a time certain perspective. So from a fisheries management perspective in the U.S., we feel like we very much are right at the point of turning that corner toward sustainable fisheries for the long term. Now, the other thing that I would mention there is that we import now more than 80% of the seafood that is consumed in this country from offshore. Over half of that is produced in aquaculture, in an aquaculture environment. Essentially, it's grown for consumption, export, et cetera. And so the ability to manage just our seafood supply, Roger, on a sustainable basis is one that I think continues to challenge us not only in this country but globally. And that is a challenge I think that plays out in many other aspects of the way that we live our lives.
So clearly this is a transnational problem. What are you doing now and how do you interface with those in other nations in this dialogue?
So in addition to some of the federal management responsibilities that I spoke to, we do a tremendous amount of international work. We're engaged with regional fishery management organizations all around the world on coordinating the understanding of the harvest of and use of highly migratory species like, for example, bluefin tuna, many others around the world. We also, by the way, in the U.S., feel like one of the things that we need to do is improve our ability to produce domestically grown seafood in aquaculture setting, whether that be in open waters or in closed systems.
Give us some practical advice here as people from Maryland. We're known for loving to consume our seafood and crab. As consumers, what are some choices or things that we need to be thinking about in preserving this for our children?
So from a seafood perspective, there are many, frankly here, in addition to some of those federal success stories that I talked about, very important success stories as it relates to local seafood like blue crabs and striped bass, which are frankly first striped bass, and now more recently because of the courageous actions of leaders in Maryland and Virginia, blue crabs, on a very sustainably produced pathway. So you might want to continue to take great advantage of those of those locally grown and sustainably managed seafoods. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, for all Marylanders that continues to challenge us are the broader habitat declines that we still continue to struggle with in Chesapeake Bay region. So while we can manage those fish stocks in a way that continue to produce a sustainable supply, the capacity of the system to produce at current levels is compromised by pollutants of all sorts, but particularly nutrient enrichment that continues to create challenges from in the bay. So all of the decisions that we make regarding where we live, what kind of car we drive, how we live as a part of this landscape are incredibly important to the productive capacity of the Chesapeake Bay region.
What are some immediate actions, particularly if we think about the Chesapeake Bay region particularly? We all realize the incredible complexity of agencies, organizations that you deal with when enacting both local, state, and federal legislations. If we could put you in charge of the world here, and you don't have to deal with the political side of all of this, and you could take some actions immediately, what are a couple of things that you would do?
So interestingly, dating back now 30 years in the Bay region, the big progress that has been made particularly in the area of point sources. Outfalls from sewage treatment plants, smokestacks, and the like. And the place where we have really struggled is in controlling what we call non-point sources. So, for example, farmers have been actively engaged in putting in place things like buffers adjacent to their fields, between their fields and waterways to minimize the runoff of excess fertilizer or sediment into waterways. In the same way, we have to look at some of our urban and suburban communities. We have to maximize things that basically take up rainwater and manage them more naturally into the system. So things like planting around your yard, natural rain gardens, are things that can have a big impact. There are a number of other choices that we make in the type of car that we drive. There are tremendous implications associated with atmospheric deposition, nitrogen that falls out of the sky that originates from tailpipes. So choices about cars, choices about how far we drive are all a very collectively important part of this of meeting this challenge.
We've certainly heard varying perspectives over the past decade at the federal level about the role that climate change might be playing in all of this as well. What is the current administrative position on climate change, and does that play at all into the work you're doing in NOAA?
Oh, absolutely. So at the same time that we think about the changing habitats because of more contemporary challenges like pollution, we have to think about the changes that are brought about on the system because of climate change. And changes in rainfall patterns, distribution of water that have tremendous implications for the productive capacity of these systems. I didn't get a chance to really talk much in my opening comment about issues out in the western part of the country, but one of the big challenges that we face is in protecting salmon runs in the face of drought conditions and competing uses for water out there. One of the other things that I would note very quickly but importantly is that in addition to climate change, one of the big challenges that the oceans face is the issue of ocean acidification. So our increasing the increasing ability that we have to affect our atmosphere is having very profound effects on our oceans, which not only have great buffering capacity with respect to the management of carbon dioxide, but also have important chemical roles that they play in relation to not only shellfish, but early life stages of a number of other important species.
You talked about you just returned from New England, and I know you've been doing a considerable amount of work there regarding legislation, federal legislation. Talk a little bit about quota shares and pluses and minuses of quota shares as ways to manage fisheries, and particularly, can you talk about that as it relates to large boat, small boat fisheries and the challenges there?
Okay, well, again, a subject we could spend a lot of time on, but probably not to necessarily the great interest of many in the audience. But
you'd be surprised.
So I talked about catch limits. which is ensuring that for a given stock of fish, we don't allow it to be removed more than appropriate, and then allows that stock of fish to sustain itself, or in the case where the stock is already depressed, sustain itself and rebuild to some historical capacity. That places great challenge on fishermen who are working hard to make a living, in many cases in competition with each other, and they're in competition with each other in ways that do not necessarily allow them to look to the longer term future of that stock. So in some sense you have, well, it's really the tragedy of the commons, right? My ability to go out and catch one more fish accrues entirely as a benefit to me, and the cost of that is spread over all the other fishermen. So what we have been advocating more recently is a policy of allocation of shares of a quota that are called catch shares. And the intention is then by taking whatever the total allowable catch for that fishery, appropriate total allowable catch for that fishery for that year is, and dividing it up at the outset amongst the participants in the fishery, we can give the fishermen more ability to bring fish to the market when they're most valuable, give fishermen the opportunity to catch them when the costs are the least, but at the same time align their incentives more clearly with the longer term incentive of maintaining the sustainable productivity of that stock for a long time. You asked specifically about small boats and large boats. Obviously, there are different efficiencies that might exist for different kinds of vessels. And this isn't all about just economic efficiency. It's also, particularly when you're in a place like New England, but in many other places around the country, it's about community character, and it's about aligning, it's about having a vision for the way that the commercial fishery in particular, might fit in the context of that community. So one of the things that we do is work closely with fishery management councils, which are regional councils of fishermen and state managers and environmentalists, to design catch share systems from the ground up so that they meet those local objectives, the local vision for that fishery, at the same time that they realize the benefits of the allocation of a quota share more precisely to individuals.
So when you and these people show up in suits and you're sitting down with Captain Raj and his buddies from Deadliest Catch and you're convincing them, hey, we've got a great idea that's going to work, guys. How do you convince these fishermen that you need to do this and in the long run it's going to work for you guys?
So what we figured out is that the guys in the suits don't convince them. The only way they're going to be convinced is in interacting with, or the predominant way they're going to be convinced is, number one, in interacting with other fishermen from other places who have seen this benefit them. And by learning from that experience and applying it to their particular fishery in a way that is tailored to the needs of that community, we see the greatest prospects for adoption and the greatest likelihood of long-term success.
So that's what's happening now in New England?
To a large degree. I wouldn't say that it's entirely happening in New England. We're actually 1 year into a new sector-based management system there that has shown great promise, but is still challenging individual fishermen in particular places around the region. And so we're working very closely with the Fishery Management Council, with fishermen and local communities to build on that promise, but at the same time continue to make some adjustments to address some of the problems.
So will the catch share idea, does it work with crabs, the same as it works with fish?
So actually it very much could. I know that there are interests in Chesapeake Bay region that are exploring that very thing. In fact, at the tail end of my tenure as the fisheries director of for the state of Maryland in 2003, we were thinking about just that kind of a thing and developing what a proposal might look like. But again, that was 7, 8 years ago. They're still very much in the mode of evaluating, talking to fishermen from other communities and thinking about how it might work here.
So if we think about this area with the Chesapeake particularly, with Virginia, Delaware, North Carolina, Maryland, each state having its own set of regulations and governance, how do you deal with the inequalities that might exist there? And is there a role that the federal government can play in leveling those?
So that's certainly the purpose of, for example, the regional fishery management councils, and there are 8 of those around the country. In addition, at the state level, the Atlantic seaboard benefits from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is an interstate compact to manage species like striped bass that migrate predominantly closer to shore and predominantly in state waters, but in a way that requires shared responsibility and shared management of the fishery. Now the blue crab, for example, for Chesapeake Bay is a stock that is Chesapeake Bay specific primarily. So that is primarily a responsibility that involves the coordinated activity of Maryland and Virginia. The big breakthrough that was made most recently with respect to blue crabs in the Bay is that Governor O'Malley and then Governor Kane worked very closely on the most aggressive management plan ever put in place to protect spawning female crabs, which migrate from Maryland waters down through the Bay and stage at the mouth of the Bay in Virginia waters. And so protecting them in the course of their migration, but at the same time while they're buried in the mud at the mouth of the Bay, preparing to spawn the next spring and summer, requires shared and coordinated action. And Governor O'Malley, Governor Kane did that very effectively, and we're seeing the benefit of that in the Bay right now.
It's several people in the audience who want to know your opinions on a couple of different issues, so let me hop between those. The first one, ocean zoning. Yes. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's been a lot of talk about the idea of what's not so much ocean zoning as ocean planning, and my view is this. There are a lot of traditional uses out there, fishermen being prominent among them, both commercial and recreational, but there are a lot of new uses emerging in ocean areas. There are renewable energy projects, tidal energy on the West Coast, wind energy on the East Coast, that are seeking a place in our coastal and ocean waters. We obviously have to account for some of the traditional energy, oil and gas drilling. Ship traffic is on the increase. There are a lot of competing demands for space in the oceans that didn't maybe exist 20 or 30 years ago. And planning for the needs of those competing demands, and at the same time protecting important habitat areas and the potential for traditional users to continue to pursue their uses, requires a more proactive, a more aggressive planning approach to our inshore coastal and offshore ocean areas. So I'm a big proponent. It's something we need to do. If we don't do it, it's going to continue to unfold haphazardly, and all of the users are going to lose out.
Totally different topic. Antibiotics and how they're affecting marine fishes.
Yeah, well, that's a big concern, particularly in some of the inshore areas. We've seen, for example, in the Potomac River, antibiotics that originate from both the human waste stream as well as potentially from the agricultural waste stream that have had some that seem to be yielding some alarming impacts with respect to intersex fish and some challenges in reproductive behaviors in particularly fish in some of the freshwater streams. It's an area of intense research. It's an area that I think that we as yet as a society don't have a really good handle on, but it's one that we have to pay close attention to.
I had an opportunity last year to hear some perspectives from Jean-Michel Cousteau, who talked significantly about the chemicals involved in fire retardants and their impact. Can you talk about not only those kinds of chemicals, but what are some of the other big chemical concerns in relation to their impact on the fish chain?
So there are a lot of, in addition to some of the chemicals we just talked about, other chemicals that are out there that have the potential to have impact in several different ways. One of those is in the area of food safety. Of course, we have long-standing concerns with respect to mercury contamination, the accumulation of mercury, which comes from a number of different sources, including power plants, the burning of fossil fuels, its presence in the environment, and its bioaccumulation up through the food chain in more concentrated levels is something that is attended to very closely. There are also, as we spoke a few minutes ago, the potential for some of these chemicals to have direct impacts on the reproductive capacity of fish or their ability to grow within the environment. All big new challenges that people are working hard to understand at the same time that we work hard to minimize some of those inputs.
Obviously, the Gulf and the BP crisis has occupied a tremendous amount of your time this past year, as you mentioned in your talk earlier. It'll be a long time before we know probably the impacts here. There have been several new books that have come out looking at this question, and I find the interesting paradoxes. It's very simple to very quickly think, well, this is a terrible disaster, let's get rid of drilling. And some of these books then immediately say, well, if it weren't for petroleum, all the whales in the world would probably be dead because we would still be relying on whale oil. I think, for every person that turns around and says, we need to be spending our time taking care of the fisheries, another group of people are saying because the fishing was stopped in the Gulf, it actually saved it probably more than anything else we could have done. As we're moving into the next year or so, what are the key research questions out there that we need the answers to determine what are the long-term impacts of what happened in the Gulf?
So there are many. And let me just sort of back up and talk about the different phases of that effort. Of course, I talked about the immediate response. Almost from day one, we also began the process of assessing the damage. And that takes place under a process called the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Process, which essentially involves engagement of the state and federal trust resource managers in a way that says what happened out there to the fish, what happened to these habitats, what happened, frankly, to even some of the recreational fishing opportunity, and what was the cost of that will ultimately be addressed in some kind of a legal proceeding with the responsible parties. And so that continues to very much unfold. From a substantive perspective, I mentioned the deep water habitats as being one of the big questions that we are working hard through our research vessels as well as with cooperating scientific institutions to understand the impact of those habitats and also the impact of potential declines in those habitats on the productive capacity of the system. I mentioned bluefin tuna. The northern Gulf is the primary spawning grounds for the western Atlantic population of bluefin tuna that range from the Gulf through the Caribbean all the way up into the North Atlantic. And the impact of oil in the system during that spawning period is something on those larval stage fish and those spawning age fish is something that we probably won't understand in any kind of a quantifiable fashion for years or even decades.
The offshore drilling, yes or no?
Now, this is on tape,
That's right.
and I understand you have the potential to project this publicly. Honestly, that's something that, from our perspective, as a part of the administration, we see the need to inform the choices, to assess the potential implications for living marine resources and the habitats on which they depend. We have an important consultative role in that process with the agencies that make those decisions, primarily under the Department of Interior, and we work very closely with them in that regard, even more so since the Gulf event. But as far as the yes or no, that's not something in a professional capacity I should answer. But I will say this, which is, I doubt we'd be driving very far if we were still operating on whale blubber. Huh?
Right. I want to end actually with a quote from, this is a recent review from the New York Times, in fact last weekend's New York Times. This is the review of A Sea in Flames, which is Carl Safina's new book on the Deepwater Horizon blowout. Greg Easterbrook is the reviewer. These were fighting words to me, actually. He is, in the review, criticizing both Ken Salazar and Jane Lubchenco because here's a sentence that I want to read to you. Salazar and Lubchenco both graduated from landlocked Colorado College, a top liberal arts school, but 1,000 miles from seawater, perhaps ill-suited to prepare them for April 2010. Clearly, you made numerous references to your liberal arts education and how it's prepared you for the kinds of things that you never even knew you were going to be encountering. And I suspect you would take issue with that perspective. But tell us, why is a liberal arts education so important for someone dealing with the complex types of decisions that you're involved in every day?
So we've talked a good bit about the intersection of economics with the needs of society and the needs of natural systems, and the ability to, particularly when you're in that place between scientific understanding and policy development and implementation, you clearly need the ability to move amongst those areas, to rapidly assess and assimilate information and put it into use. And I think no better background than a liberal arts background could prepare you to do that effectively. And from my perspective, I believe that's what I've found professionally, and I believe also to have seen that in other people.
Well, you're doing a phenomenal job and a very important work that you have to preserve the future for all of us. And on behalf of everyone here at McDaniel, can you join me in a round of applause for Eric Schwaab?
Thank you all.
I've only had a chance to do this once in my career, but we know you're a graduate of Western Maryland College, but we want to make sure that people know you're also a graduate of McDaniel, and so here is a degree that will ensure that people are aware of that.
Well, thank you. I'm very proud to accept that, and you can count me among the graduates who is quite comfortable with McDaniel College as my alma mater.
Reunion events at 3 o'clock. There's a great concert in the chapel, and our next Smart Talk event, if I'm not mistaken, will be October the 1st, right here on this very stage, and I'm leaving it secret right now who our speaker is, but I hope we'll see you then. Thank you so much.
Roger, thank you. I hope that worked out okay. Yeah, good.